Hey, what's up everybody? Jason here. Thanks for stopping by the channel today. So I wanted to share 7 things that I think will make Bubble the platform of choice in 2025. So some of these are quality of life improvements. Some of these are for more, advanced beginner or intermediate and higher bubblers who might need a little more functionality and quality of life things based on, maybe having larger sites. I've got 12,000 users on my site. Probably 110 pages in total. I've got an admin portal, a portal for my trainers, a public site, a member portal, all that kind of stuff. And once you get to a certain scale, it can be a real pain in the butt to manage some of these things, just given some of the restrictions. Well, maybe not even restrictions, but once you get to a certain scale, it gets a little more difficult to manage than if you were using, say, a traditional coding platform, if you want to call it that. But I don't want to get into those debates, but I do want to talk about 7 things I think that would really make this an outstanding platform for next year. So let's dig into it. A couple of things. Bubble does these little boost events every once in a while, which is great because these are tiny little micro updates that you might look at them and go, oh, big deal, that doesn't do anything. But the key thing that stuck out is the quality of life tweaks. So this is when you get a chance to sort of fix all those dumb things and things that maybe it reduced your clicks from 4 to 1 and it just saves you a little bit of time. So I'll put that link in the description. I don't want to go through these, but you'll be able to see all the updates they've done. And another thing, if you didn't know, they have an idea board. Tons of stuff on here. I didn't go through all of these to see if the things that I'm going to go through in the video are on the list, but you can see what they've shipped and you can see all the things that have been voted on. So I'm going to dive into these 7 things. The first one would be the ability to use SQL natively in the app data tab. This would be very useful instead of having to use this search box up here or clicking this additional fields and setting all of your constraints. So if you had the ability to do CRUD operations, so create, read, update, delete from here would be really good. Now, obviously there'd have to be some safety with this because I would argue if you've got no coders going in here and doing select star from table and there's 500,000 records in there, you're going to run into some workload problems and you're going to run into potentially some performance issues. Or if you accidentally go delete star from and you delete everything. So there'd have to obviously be some safety things put in place to do this. But for advanced beginner and up, maybe intermediate and up, I think this would be super useful and a lot easier for you to find things and then also delete things and also to do bulk updates, because the current way to do bulk updates now is you create a backend workflow and then you select the records that you want by either creating a view or doing a search for certain entries, and then you basically run a workflow with that bulk function, and then you can update bulk records. So for example, if you added a new field to the database and you needed to pre-populate data with some default, you're going to have to do that with a bulk update. It would be really cool. You introduce a yes, no field, you set the default to no, but there's already 5,000 records in there. You can just say update where this field is empty, set it to no. And that would save a lot of time having to create a workflow. Next up would be the ability to use views and tables and repeating groups. So you can create as many of these views as you want in the data view. So when you click on this additional fields, if you haven't done this before, you get a pop-up that has, here's the fields that you want to display in that view and here's the constraints that you want to add. It would be really cool if you could use these views in your production app. Now, obviously, there'd have to be some safety here because you can delete these things. If you hover over these, then you get a little garbage can to delete it. You wouldn't want to delete a view. So obviously, there'd have to be a check to say, hey, dummy, this view is being used on 5 pages. You probably don't want to delete it. But at least on the public pages, it could look something like this. So when you're searching for data for tables or repeating groups, you can do a search for, you can get options, you can get data from an API. There's multiple sources in the pull down list, one of them being data types, which is all your Bubble things. And just simply adding a view option with all the views you've created would be really cool. So if you had a list of events throughout your site, you could have a view for upcoming events. Now, part of this could be user error when you're building it. So if you're doing a do search for events, for example, and you have 50 pages that are listing your upcoming events, you would obviously want to use a reusable element. So I do that with my site. So I have one reusable list of events that grabs all the upcoming events, and then there's configuration options that I have as element properties So if I'm dropping that on a public page, I can hide the edit button, for example. So that's a good way to do it. But having these views would be great, because if you wanted to introduce a pretty substantial database change, you could just update it in one view and you don't have to redeploy your app, which would be very cool. Next up, better logging. Obviously, this has always been a sore spot. The logging in Bubble is pretty terrible. And what I find is I mostly want to go into the logs and look for a specific workflow. The search doesn't always work, so it would be neat if you could go to the backend workflow and then there was a little logging button here somewhere, and that would bring you to all the times this particular workflow has run. Another option could be on the server log page. You can choose a workflow from a dropdown, or maybe there's a page dropdown. So you can say, show me all the workflows that have run or kicked off from this particular page. But this current incarnation, it's borderline unusable, especially if you have a big site and you have workflows that are being triggered or scheduled. It's pretty much impossible to find anything here and make any sense out of it in a useful way. So having the ability to choose or filter a workflow, put some date pickers on here too. This is not really fun to use either, but I know logging's been kind of a sore spot for everybody. I kind of have my own activity workflow logger. So in a lot of my backend workflows, I will have an option here that writes a record. So I know where that what the name of that workflow was, what the input for that data was, and then what the output is. And then if something goes wonky, I can look at that manually, but that should really be built into the platform natively, I think. Number 4, this would be very helpful considering that they do bill by workflow units. This page costs you this much. That could manifest itself in a couple of different ways. So you could have that in the debugger, and it just calculates how many workflow units that that page has cost you, maybe an overlay on the page or something like that. And maybe another option is if you're in the designer view, there's a little icon up here that can help you see how much resources your page is using. Now, I know there's been a couple of videos with how much the base workflow units cost, but it's still kind of a mystery. I've tried to do some tests by looking at the logs and loading an empty page, loading a page with a lot of stuff, but because the logging is kind of not really that useful, you get kind of stuck looking at every individual thing that's run on the page and just manually adding up the workflow units in your head. So if there was a way that you could see this in the design view or in the debugger view, that would really help you optimize your sites, I think. Next up, another sore spot, database level constraints, much like every database in the universe works. And this would really help with not having to use an only when condition every time you insert or update data. So I usually have 2 workflow steps. One says add this record if, do a search for, and basically put all the constraints in manually so I don't have duplicated records. And then if the record does exist, then I do an update instead. But it would be neat if you could just define these automatically, much like how the user table works. So if you've ever used the workflow option, create an account for another user, there's a little checkbox that says return if the account exists. And it basically matches up by email address. So extending that into having a series of constraints, something where you can configure what a unique record is. Maybe it's just one field. Maybe it's a pair of fields, something like that would help you not run into a situation where when I first started building with Bubble and I looked at one of my tables a few months down the road and it had like 60,000 records in it because there was one constraint that I missed. So again, you can say some of this is user error, dummy, you should have looked and checked better, which, yeah, sure, I probably should have. But it would be great if this was built in because then you don't have to worry about it. Next up, and I'm taking the lazy way out and just took a screenshot, a database visualizer. So I created one in Miro for my site when I was working with a couple of independent bubblers on building something, basically so they could understand my data model. If there was a way to visualize this would be super awesome. It could show the connections where you are, essentially using the idea of join tables, or where you've got lists of fields from other data things in some of these other ones. You could see how everything is kind of visually connected together. Very helpful with larger sites. I wouldn't even know how to build this. I think this would be kind of a huge undertaking, but it would be something that would be really useful, especially if you collaborate with others. So if they're trying to understand your data model, it's kind of impossible just looking at a list of data things here. So being able to visualize this would be really, really cool. Last but not least, I think we've all seen the updates to the workflow editor, and to my brain, it's basically no different than what it was, except everything goes this way instead of this way. So having some type of make.com style workflow visualization, if you've never used make.com, it's basically an automation platform where you can connect any SaaS-based service out there and pretty much any API. So having this router function and having filters that you can label, because one of the problems becomes you have to start looking at those only when clauses. If you've got more complicated workflow, you could make the argument that if you have too many steps in your workflow, you could break that out in a better way by using custom events and things like that. But if there was a visualization like this for more non-technical people, I think it would be much, much easier to create your workflows and also troubleshoot them. All right, so that's it. That's my top 7 list of what I think would make Bubble an incredible platform, especially for people who kind of get to that intermediate and more advanced level, and especially for people who are no coders. So I think if you're coming to Bubble as a developer, you probably can deal with all of this stuff on your own by doing things in a certain way. But if you're non-technical, which that's what this channel is for, people who are new to no-code platforms, or maybe they're a little bit copy and paste coder-ish, but they haven't been a developer before, some of these things I think would make it really, really easy for you to up your game in Bubble. So what do you think? Drop a comment below if you think any of these are a really good idea. In the meantime, I am going to check the idea board and see if some of those are up there, and then I'll upvote those. And other than that, that's it. Like and subscribe. See you next time.